Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Finals overview and analysis video in the Summer Split Playoffs, the final series of kind of the regular season here in the LCK, the regular domestic play. Of course, the LCK isn't done after this. We still have the regional qualifiers to determine the final two teams that end up representing the LCK at Worlds, but this will be the final series of the playoffs. We know these two teams are going to Worlds as the number 1 and the number 2 seeds, but what order will they be going in? And more importantly, who will be crowned your 2024 LCK Summer Split champion? I'm very excited to see how this goes. If you want to know how we got here, my thoughts on these teams leading into a series like this, please check out the video and the playlist up in the iCard. The semifinals is going to be listed up there by itself, but of course, also the LCK playlist with every single game of the LCK Summer Split. It's all going to be in there if you're interested in just my thoughts on these teams, how we got here in terms of the LCK, whatever you are interested, it's all going to be listed up in that iCard. Of course, not required viewing. You don't need to see it in order to understand what's going to happen in today's video. We're going to be going over the finals in isolation, previewing these teams. We'll be talking about how they got here, the expectations for them once they got here. All of that stuff will be in this video, but if you're interested in that stuff, check it out. But with that being said, let's jump into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game here in the finals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. And at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series, or in this case, a finals MVP, to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be talking about the year as a whole at the end of this, because the two teams that are playing today, they're done domestically for the rest of the year. They've already qualified for Worlds. This will be the last series they play regardless of the outcome, but we still have more LCK action coming up after this with the regional qualifiers. We'll quickly talk about that bracket. We'll talk about who I expect to be representing the LCK at Worlds as the 3 and 4 seeds. All of that stuff will be at the end of the video, but of course, most of today will be spent talking about the finals. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Of course, this is a gigantic matchup. These are the two best teams in the LCK, in my opinion, 2 of the top 3 teams in the entire world, as I've stated for basically all of this split. It's the number 1 seeded Gen.G taking on the number 2 seeded Hanwha Life Esports, and I'm really excited about this matchup. Obviously, a lot of former, teammates playing off against each other here. You have half of the Gen.G coalition playing against the other half of the Gen.G coalition with, Chovy and Pays taking on Doran, Peanut, and Delight. Really excited to see that. Those former teammates always put on a good show when they play against each other, but these are, like I said, 2 of the most talented and impressive teams in the world, regardless of the situation at the current moment. They are clearly 2 of the top 3 teams, alongside, in my opinion, Billy Gaming over in the LPL, and I think that they both have proven that they deserve to be here. However, there is one gigantic favorite coming into this series, and that is Gen.G. As highly as I think of HLE, it doesn't necessarily feel like they are on the same tier, at least going into this series, as a team like Gen.G, and I think that was exemplified pretty clearly in the winners finals that these two teams already played in earlier on here in the playoffs, where yes, HLE was able to pick up a win in game 1. It was an okay game, but Gen.G kind of threw it to them. They weren't necessarily playing their best, and ever since that point forward, like games 2, 3, and 4 of that series were very Gen.G favored. It was kind of a blowout, didn't necessarily feel all that close. That leads me to believe that Gen.G are gigantic favorites going into a series like this, and I really don't think there's any reason to believe otherwise. They've lost, 4 games over the course of this split. 2 of them were in one day. They lost 1 game to HLE here in the playoffs and another one in the regular season, but they've only lost 4 games in the summer split. It's genuinely been a ridiculous run. They won MSI. They really dominated that tournament as well, and there's really no reason to believe that this isn't the clear favorite to be by far the best team in the world. At the current moment, the Golden Road is very much still on the table for them, winning LCK in the spring split, winning MSI, obviously going in as pretty big favorites here, but HLE don't want to give that away quietly. As much as they are underdogs going into a series like this, that's kind of where a lot of these players thrive in terms of perception. We know players like Zeka have really overperformed in that role in the past, winning the 2022 World Championships on DRX as the underdogs. I'm a big fan of Zeka. He's probably the channel darling from back in the day for me, but, players like Peanut have a ridiculous track record of continuously winning at this level. Doran has basically always stepped up in finals when he's played in them. He is actually really good in terms of these clutch moments. Viper and Delight are one of the scarier bot lanes in the world, one of the few that I think can mechanically match, Pays and Lehens on the other side of this matchup. This isn't some sort of pushover team. This isn't one of those series where, the favorite is so much better than the underdog that if the underdog does anything, that it's going to be a surprise. Like, HLE is good enough to beat anybody on any day. The problem is not HLE. The problem is not how good or bad that team is. The problem is that Gen.G just feels untouchable at the current moment. They have proven over and over again that they are the beast at the end of the tunnel that needs to be conquered. If HLE can conquer them, that's going to be massive for them and their confidence going into Worlds. An already really good team getting that level of confidence going into that gigantic tournament could be really good, but that's why they're underdogs, because as good as they are and as much as they do, Gen.G has just been a little bit better over the course of this year, and more notably, HLE has just not been able to beat Gen.G at all. I think that's the most concerning part is really, HLE has not put a dent into Gen.G. I think they only have one game win. I could be wrong about that. This entire year, I don't remember what happened in winners finals of last split, but at worst, like, they've got 1 or 2 game wins against Gen.G all year long. With all of the times that they've played against them, Gen.G has very much had their number in 2024. And so either that's going to change here today, or Gen.G is going to continuously dominate the LCK and prove that they are, at least going into Worlds, clearly the best team in the world. There's only one way to find out which direction that's going to go, though, and that's, of course, going to be to go game by game. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Going game by game means we get to start with game number 1. So the winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this might be a big revelation for a lot of people. This might be a big, like, whoa, HLE can actually compete in this series. I'm asking to pump the brakes at least after game number 1 because if you remember, this is exactly what happened in winners finals. HLE took game number 1 in a really close game where Gen.G just made a couple of mistakes down the stretch that ended up costing them. HLE got really confident, and then Gen.G just turned it on and absolutely dominated the rest of that series. It wasn't even remotely close. I'm not saying that that's definitely going to happen here today. I think that there was a lot more of Gen.G trying in game number 1. This wasn't quite just Gen.G throwing the game to HLE like it was in winners finals, but still, like, this was a very close game that ended in a very close situation. Gen.G was up in gold even after HLE took the Nexus, and so this isn't one of those situations where HLE just came out and dominated Gen.G. You don't want to just sell the farm saying Gen.G are washed or that HLE are going to dominate the series. I don't know if I believe that, but I do want to give a lot of credit to HLE because this was a really important performance from them to get out to a good start here in the LCK finals. Player of the game in game 1 to me is very clearly Viper. I know a lot of people are going to be talking about Zeka as well. This was kind of a 2v8 for a majority of this game, and I definitely do not want to take anything away from Zeka, but Viper was unbelievable in game number 1 here. Everything you could want to see out of your superstar AD carry at the start of the finals. He's the one player that doesn't really have, like, as concrete of a storyline coming into this for HLE. Obviously, Dorian, Peanut, Delight playing against their former org. Zeka has never really been able to beat Chovy all that consistently. It really was just 2022 Worlds, and outside of that, Zeka has actually not played particularly well into Chovy individually, and so those are a lot of fun storylines, but Viper just kind of here. He's part of the HLE team. Obviously, he's a very important piece. I'm not trying to take away his importance to the actual, like, gameplay of HLE. He's very important. He's a big reason why this team is here, but storyline-wise, he's probably the player that has the least connection to this narrative, but he's the one who stepped up the most here in game number 1, and the former world champion is definitely starting to get back into more consistent form. I've been pretty on the Viper bandwagon throughout a lot of this year. It's funny because I was off of it for a lot of last year, not like completely off of it, but just everybody was calling him the number 1 ADC, that he was mega elo stuck on HLE in 2023. I wasn't really subscribing to that theory. I thought that there were a couple of players on HLE that were playing really well, Zeka very much included in that. Viper wasn't just 1v9 in the same way that the narrative kind of shaped around him, and then this year I think he's been basically exactly the same as what he was last year. He's just been really, really solid for this team, very consistent, not necessarily the highest of highs, but, a lot of really good games, and that consistency in the 2v2 in the bot lane is what kind of propels this team forward, and so to see him step up and basically have perfect positioning, perfect team fighting in the back half of this game when it matters the most, it's essential. Like, this was an unbelievable game on the Ashe. Typically speaking, you're not thinking of Ashe 1v9ing in terms of damage, but absolutely he was able to do that in this game, and a lot of it just came down to him being more mechanically talented than everybody else on the Rift. I definitely don't want to downsell Zeka, though. I don't want this to come across like I'm trying to say Viper 1v9. That was not the case. This was a 2v8, a lot more than a 1v9. Zeka was incredible, and obviously them getting that end at the end of the game, them being able to take the Nexus in a situation where I think most teams just never in a million years go for that. For those two to just say, screw it, we're going to go for it, it's awesome. And it created a gigantic banger here in game one. Zeka was nearly perfect, wasn't quite as expansive, and mechanically speaking, I think Viper did a lot more interesting things this game than Zeka did, which is why I'm giving player of the game to Viper, but Zeka was still unbelievable for this team. I think Doran, Peanut, and Delight, not necessarily perfect here in game number one. There were definitely some pluses and minuses. I don't love the Mordekaiser pick on R5. I think generally speaking, you can kind of counter that champion, and we saw that a lot in this game. You know, Peanut, Delight, I think they need to get a tad bit more consistent. Delight was fine. I guess generally speaking, a lot of setup here, but only so much Leona can do in the back half of these games when, honestly, she does die incredibly quickly to things like Smolder, but Peanut, I think, needs to have more early game prio and early game pressure. I think that is going to be something that really dictates whether or not this series can be in the hands of HLE, but if your carry duo is going to be playing like this, a lot of problems, a lot of ailments are just going to be solved by throwing them out on the Rift. But for Gen.G on the other side, this is not entirely ideal with how you maybe wanted to start your series. I think, again, starting 0-1 against HLE is really just not the best, like, especially because this game very much felt like it was in your hands. The Smolder was super fed, and if you were able to just do a little bit more to peel for Chovy in the back half of this game, I think you probably just win it very cleanly, but HLE just played better. They had better execution in the back half, and they had the best player in the game in Viper, which is definitely not a great situation for Gen.G, but again, I'm not hitting the panic button. I'm not freaking out about this result only because, like, oh, Gen.G lost. Like, they did this in the winners finals. Gen.G will, you know, be able to bounce back, at least mentally. It's just all about whether or not HLE can keep up that level of pressure. Chovy was excellent in this game. A lot of it was the champion. I know a lot of people are going to complain about Smolder. Anybody who watches the channel knows that I'm a little bit more on the side of Smolder can be stopped. His early game is still very weak, and generally speaking, if you don't have that secondary carry, it's a little bit more difficult for him to 1v9 than maybe some of the other ridiculously broken hyper carries that we've seen in the past. Not that he can't do it, you just need a little bit more setup, because the champion himself doesn't really have any sort of utility. He's just all damage, and so, you know, getting Chovy in these positions is great, and Smolder did 1 billion damage in this game, but they had no one to really capitalize on the fact that Smolder was really strong, so if you were able to get on him or really kind of take him out of his own comfort zone, the champion became basically irrelevant down the stretch of this game, which is very crazy to say. Again, still doing a lot of damage. I think irrelevant was maybe not the right term, but you know what I mean. Like, he wasn't as relevant as Viper on the Ashe, who was in better spots, or Zeka on the Tristana, who was in better spots, even though he as a champion was capable of doing so much more than those others. And I don't even really blame it on Chovy. I don't think this is necessarily a Chovy problem. I think he played great in this game. I just don't think the rest of the team around him was doing all that much. Canyon had a great early game on the Skarner, wasn't really able to keep that up in team fights, was kind of irrelevant when it mattered the most. You have players like Keen and Lehens that were invisible for a lot of the back half of this game. Keen is going to get dud of the game here. Where was he? Like, what was the Cassante doing? This should be a pretty free matchup. I understand that in a lot of these instances, you know, Mordekaiser makes things a lot more difficult, and, you know, you have a lot of things to consider, but Cassante's got to be aggressive. He's got to be able to step in and at least try to force HLE to play a little bit more contested. I just don't think that happened in game number one as much as I would have liked it to, but we're kind of grasping at straws here for Gen.G. This was still a pretty good game. This was an absolute banger in game number one of the most fun games that we've gotten in the entirety of the LCK playoffs, and it's just game one here in the finals. If Gen.G can bounce back and win game two in the same way that they did in winners finals, then I'm really not going to be all that concerned about them. Going into a best of three, I feel like Gen.G is very comfortable in that situation, but for HLE, if they can somehow manage that 2-0 series lead, wow, all of a sudden, things get a lot more interesting, because winning 3 games in a row, even for Gen.G, it's not easy against a team like HLE. So, it's a very important game number 2. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we are back here to an even series state. This is kind of what we were all anticipating after that game number 1. It's just really hard to beat Gen.G 2 games in a row. I'm not saying that it's impossible to beat them in a series, but beating them 2 games in a row is really, really difficult to do. Just getting ahead of them in that way is really difficult to do. It's not very common or often that these teams are just going to have bad games back to back, but I think this was much more of what we saw towards the back half of winners finals. I think from a competitive perspective, it's almost identical, in my opinion, to what we were seeing in winners finals, where HLE is just kind of throwing some weird leads away. I think people are going to blame draft for this one a lot, I've seen that sentiment a lot on the internet. Anybody who's followed the channel for a little bit knows that I'm not going to be nearly as hard on this draft. There were a lot of picks in here that I think are incredibly undervalued right now, and some champions, Jin, cough cough, that I think are just viewed incorrectly by the community as a whole. I don't know why Jin gets this reputation of being this like no damage champion. He's absolutely not that. We've seen it 100 times. Every single like dominant AD carry has proven over and over again that Jin can do damage if you get him leads in the early game. People just don't play towards him, and I think that that's the problem here, is that, you know, you're not actively investing in Jin. He's not going to be, you know, Zeri. He's not going to be Kaisa or whatever, these hyper carries that you're going to pick in the bot lane. He's not the same as those champions, but pretending like getting this guy gold is going to do nothing for your team is just, at this point, ignorant. Like, we have seen way too many examples of Jin popping off and absolutely carrying games. Go watch any JD gaming game over the course of this year with Ruler just completely obliterating people on him, but I digress. I won't hang on this. I think Gen.G just outplayed them. I think they were just the better team in this game. This wasn't a draft gap, in my opinion. This was a gameplay gap, and I'm happy to talk about that. Player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Lehens. For me, this Blitzcrank was just unstoppable in terms of the playmaking potential for a lot of this game, and this is the problem with Gen.G, is they're so creative in terms of how they want to get their flank angles off that it opens up opportunities for champions that are really easy to playmake and execute on, like Blitzcrank, to be incredibly oppressive in basically anybody's hands. I love Lehens, do not get me wrong. I got so much flack in the offseason for saying that he was better than Delight and that he was going to be an upgrade, quote-unquote, to this Gen.G team, or at the very least, like a side grade. Like, I don't know why I got so much pushback, but obviously that has turned out to be true. I love Lehens. I'm not trying to discredit him, but playing Blitzcrank for Gen.G is like the easiest job in the world, because they create these situations where HLE have to walk up and have to face check with some of their weaker members, and then it's just free to be able to land a lot of these hooks and be able to create. That being said, the Blitzcrank was by far the most important member of the team, because the things that he was creating were great, and there were a couple of hooks. You can pinpoint 2, 3, 4 hooks throughout this game where I don't think a lot of other supports in the world land them besides Lehens, or find the angle to be able to create besides Lehens. I think the team itself plays really well around these aggressive playmakers, but you obviously have to have a player that's going to be able to capitalize on it. Lehens is one of the best supports in the world. You're not shocked to see this kind of outcome. I think your carry duo was also excellent in this game. Chovy and Pays both doing a billion damage. Chovy in particular, I think being so good in the mid lane 1v1 really opened up more options for Gen.G. Typically speaking, in the Corki Azir matchup, Azir is going to have at least a little bit more prio to be able to do things in the early game from my experience. It's just, you know, Azir's really hard to shut down. His numbers are quite low right now, though, so perhaps I'm going off of old information, but Chovy was just a lot more active in terms of moving around the map and creating with Canyon and trying to capitalize on, you know, the Blitzcrank and the Ashe and a lot of the playmaking tools that Gen.G had. The Corki was way more useful in this game, and that was important, I think, for the draft overall. Pays was very good. He continues to be awesome as long as he's not destroyed in the early game. That's where his weakness lies. As long as he's able to get through the first 5 to 8 minutes of the game, he's going to be one of the best AD carries in the world. Canyon was excellent, a much better game number 2 in my opinion, and Keen was also very consistent on the Ornn. Overall, just a really good game for Gen.G, and not so good of a game in my opinion from HLE. This was kind of a bad performance. I know it's kind of hard to rag on a team that's in the finals, but this did not feel like a finals team in terms of the performance they put out here in game number 2. They threw away a lot of opportunities, and that's why I say this is less of a draft gap in my mind and more of a gameplay gap, because I absolutely think that there were ways to get online here for HLE. They just didn't take any of them, and I understand that some of these champions are a little bit lower in power. When you draft something like Ivern, I think it is more, you know, prudent, more productive to draft a hyper carry in the bot lane than something like Jin, but this is a winnable game if you can get your Azir into a good position, and they just didn't do that. I think a lot of that is on the team, but a lot of that is also on Zeka, who's going to get my dud of the game. I love Zeka. You know, he's a player that I really like, but the Azir has looked more questionable this year than it has in past years. I've been pretty pro, like, Zeka Azir. People have always really shit on this in the same way that people will shit on, like, anybody playing Corki, like Zeka playing Corki or whatever. People have always found reasons to dislike Zeka for basically no reason. I do think the Azir in particular has been more questionable. Maybe it's just because the Corki has gotten so much better and he's, like, actually very good at that champion now, but, you know, the Azir just has not looked great for him, and honestly, it's not really looked all that great for anyone not named Faker. That's really been the only player that's had any sort of consistent success in the LCK on Azir, and so, you know, maybe it's just the champion, maybe you just move away from it, but this was just not a great game. He's whiffing ultimates. That one on Chovy in the back half of the game where it looks like just barely misses is so consequential towards them being able to win this game. It's, or at least stay in this game, I should say. It's actually astounding, but it is what it is. Like, Zeka just wasn't very good. You can blame the team for not enabling him as much. I think Doran had a pretty rough game on the top side here on the Renekton. Not much for that champ to do once Ornn starts to get some items. You can't really break through that front line unless you get a really good flank angle, and you've got so much peel on the side of Gen.G. It's just really difficult to operate here for Renekton. Delight, I didn't think was also particularly good. Viper was kind of useless. The Jhin did not get any sort of early lead, did not get any sort of gold, and that's when he starts to be low damage as a champion. And then, you know, Peanut on the Ivern, and you're trying to enable a not fed Azir and a not fed Jhin. Like, it's not good. So HLE just kind of with a bad game number 2. I think they just misplayed a lot of things around the map, and I think they have to be better in game number 3. If Gen.G can, you know, take control of this series, go up for the first time 2-1, that's going to be a big problem, I think, for HLE, because if that's the momentum that you're carrying into the back half of the series, what's really separating this from feeling all like winners finals and all of the other series that you've played against Gen.G before, or even if you are able to capitalize on a couple of mistakes, you're not able to stick. We need to see HLE show up again in game 3, but I'm sure Gen.G wants to be able to maintain that dominance and show up once again in game number 3 and take that series lead. Only one of those teams is going to get their wish. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series for the first time 2-1, and it is dangerously getting close to looking exactly like winners finals did, where game 1 was given to HLE. There was a lot going right, a lot going wrong. I think HLE did play better in game 1 in this series than they did in the previous one, but still, you know, a game 1 win into 2 straight Gen.G performances where they just kind of show that they are the better team. There is more fight to HLE in this series for sure, but at least through the first 3 games, there's really not a lot of reason to believe that it's going to be all that different going throughout the rest of this series. Another great performance here from Gen.G, and this time it was a top side gap player of the game. Very obviously going to go to Keen. We will get to Doran in just a moment. He had a miserable game 3 performance, a truly horrible one, which we will definitely talk about, but Keen showing up. He's kind of been a little up and down over the course of the playoffs. I think that maybe I've been a little bit too harsh on him. You know, thinking back to some of the games that I've been pretty critical of when it comes to Keen, a lot of it is just, okay, Gen.G's expectations are ridiculously high, and Keen not really being as involved as maybe you would expect the number 1 top laner in the world to be, at least over the course of the last few series, but there really haven't been these gigantic mistakes. Like, he's not losing the game instantaneously for his team in the same way that other top laners, you know, globally kind of are right now. Keen has been good, and maybe I've undersold that, I think, on this channel. This was a great performance. This was really good from him on the Jax. The R5 Jax is very, very strong. Obviously, we know he can play this champion well. Hell, Doran can play this champion really well, and so I'm sure he knew the matchup at least a little bit, but Keen just got super fed on Jax and was able to completely obliterate this 1v1 the moment that he started receiving resources from the rest of this team. It was genuinely just over. Typically speaking, we're not talking about a lot of top lane gaps. We're not talking about a lot of like top side gaps really at all as being super impactful on the current meta. This was definitely a bit of a change of pace in that regard. I think also going towards something like Skarner more consistently for this team is more of a positive. We talked a lot about Maokai on this channel over the past couple of weeks. I think from a general perspective, Maokai is a very strong champion, but I've continued to very much disagree with his priority as the number 1 jungler in a lot of these drafts as a B1 style pick. He's not nearly as versatile and as like ubiquitous as I think a lot of these teams are drafting him to be. He is very weak in the early game. He is very susceptible to just not having pressure through the first like 10 to 15 minutes of the game. He is the best jungler in the game by far when you get to these 20-25 minute, you know, like team fights, objective control, especially if you go further beyond that. He is the best tank in the entire game without question at the current moment, in my opinion, but getting there is sometimes a bit of a problem, and honestly, getting there is the most important part of the game right now, and so having something like Skarner that can punish that early while still being very useful in these late fights, we've already seen the value of it. In game 1, it was pretty solid, and in game 3 here, it's even more so for Canyon, so really good stuff, I would say, from the top side of the map for Gen.G. You know, Pei's pulling out the Ziggs. We've seen this kind of dominate the LCK as well. Teams don't really seem all that interested in trying to check its tower-taking ability in the early game. Not quite as much of a game breaker here as it has been in other series for HLE in particular, but still pretty solid. You know, Chovy, Lahens, I thought played pretty well here. Gen.G were just good across the board, but this was definitely a top gap game, and that's where HLE is going to need to look to find some improvements. Doran was just not good enough here. Camille continues to be this, like, super feast or famine pick. We've actually talked about this as well a ton on this channel. A lot of people who watch all of my content, who watch all of the regions, they're definitely getting rewarded with some of the payouts here in terms of how these results are going, because basically everything in terms of champions has really played out exactly as we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks, with champions like Camille really struggling, and I just don't understand the priority on this champion. Even more baffling to me is the blind pick priority on this champion. I think it is completely indefensible. Like, blind picking Camille in this meta is just just not possible. You cannot do this. You cannot get away with this. I think Doran is not in a position where he should be doing this against the best top laner in the world, regardless of whether or not you think that he's played well over the past couple of weeks, which I definitely have. I think he's been undervalued for this HLE team by the community, but this was horrible. Camille continues to just not really be able to do anything, specifically if you put any amount of resources into her with the other team. Like, if you send Skarner up to the top lane once, like, her game is over. She can no longer fight ever again, and there's just no reason to ever pick this champion in this circumstance. I think this was actually a game-losing, like, B5 decision, because the moment that they started, like, snowballing and compounding on top of her getting behind, there was just no actual way to play the game. Now, Doran is not indefensible. I'm not just sitting here and saying that him drafting the Camille was immediately game over. You can win on Camille. We've seen some performances. I think it was Zeus who had that ridiculous pop-off game on Camille. If you're able to get her into a good position, she does still win in the later half of the game if you can snowball her. The problem is that teams are very aware that you can shut her down instantly. Like, that feast or famine style just bleeds in, and the moment that Doran got shut down in the early game and had to play from behind in gold, it was genuinely over. He was never going to be able to do anything ever again. So, bad game from Doran. I already said my Maokai thing. Like, Peanut's a really good Maokai player. If you're going to get to those late game situations, like, Maokai's going to be fine, but he was never even in gold, and therefore Skarner had so much pressure in this game. I think Viper and Delight continue to be fine here. I'm not going to bring up the Jhin stuff anymore. It honestly is just not worth my time at this point. If you are not on board with Jhin, that's fine. You're not going to be on board with Jhin with me saying anything. Like, if you know what I mean? If you watch my content and you're still not a Jhin believer, then there's nothing I can say at this point that's going to change your mind, and that's okay. There's just nothing left for me to say. I think Jhin is a fine champion, and I think he does a lot of really good things. If you disagree with that, that's fine. It is what it is, but Viper and Delight were not the problem this game. Zeka on the Yone was trying some interesting things, was trying to be aggressive, just didn't really have the prio or the tempo with the rest of the team to be able to do that. Yone is very team reliant in a lot of these situations, and unfortunately for HLE, they just didn't have that to be able to play off of. This was another, I don't want to say rough game, but games 2 and 3, they have looked outclassed. They have not looked like the better team, and now they are one game away from losing the finals. That wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world. It would be a repeat of winners finals, and I'm sure Gen.G does want to close this out in 4, but HLE has so much talent and so much potential. We would love to see them at the very least push this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, especially with how awesome that opening package was and how hyped up this LCK finals was, how good the league is at the current moment. I would really love to see HLE pick up that game 4 win, but I'm sure Gen.G would love to close this out in 4 games and get their, you know what, 5th title in a row here in the LCK. I'm sure that they would love to do that. So, are they going to be able to close it out, or is HLE going to be able to push us to that Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and we are heading to an LCK Finals Silver Scrapes game number 5. This is exactly what we were asking for going into a series like this. We were asking for both of these teams to step up when it mattered the most, and both of them are absolutely delivering at the current moment. A fantastic showing here from HLE. This is the best game they've played this series by a country mile. This was just a dominating performance, and a lot of the things they needed to go right ended up going right. Really happy to see that, none more so than the phenomenal performance that they got out of the mid lane here. Player of the game is very obviously going to go to Zeka. Honestly, to me, this is kind of like the inverse of game 1, where Zeka and Viper are still kind of the duo carries. Not to say that the rest of the team didn't play much better than they did in game number 1. This was a much more complete performance, I think, from HLE, but Zeka and Viper very much still the carries and both very much still showing unbelievable moments. But this time, instead of Viper being the one that was clearly just kind of S tier, I think Zeka was the one that was S tier. When this guy is on, he is one of the best mid laners in the world. I shouldn't even say that. That feels disrespectful. He has been one of the best mid laners in the world for 3 straight years now, and people keep talking as if he isn't. I really don't understand the narrative surrounding Zeka. He was awesome last year. He was really good for a team that just couldn't find any sort of consistency near the top side of the map. They end up making some changes, and he plays basically identical to what he was in 2023, yet now people are taking him more seriously because the team around him is better. It's kind of a similar thing for Viper. I think a lot of it ends up being kind of the opposite for Viper. People were talking him down a lot this year, where they were hyping him up so much last year because of the, quote, 1v9ing. Zeka and Viper were 2v8ing for a lot of last year on HLE. You would know that if you watched a lot of my content, or you would know that at least I feel that watching a lot of my my content. I'm not trying to say it's the only opinion to have, but you would know that that's been my take for a while. And so Zeka just showing up and outperforming Chovy, like, it's a little bit of a surprise because Chovy is really good, and Chovy wasn't even awful in this game. He was the best player on Gen.G, but still, like, Zeka coming up and showing this, it's not the most surprising thing in the world to anybody who's watched a consistent amount of his gameplay over the last, I don't know, 3-4 years. I mean, even before he won Worlds, this guy was dominating. I got a lot of flack for putting him as my second team all-pro mid laner in 2022 before Worlds, and, you know, all he's done since then is live up to the hype, live up to the expectation. I'm tired of people pretending like Zeka is not a world-class player, a borderline, at times, top, 5 to 8 player in the world. He's just there. He has been there for quite a long time, and I'm glad he's finally starting to get the recognition, doing it on such a big stage, showing such a mastery of a champion like Tristana, and doing it into a team like Gen.G and a player like Chovy. Incredibly impressive, and you just have to be excited for him. Viper obviously does deserve a lot of credit and a lot of praise as well. He wasn't quite the game breaker that Zeka was, in my opinion, but his mechanics are unreal. Like, truly, from a mechanical perspective, I don't know if there is a cleaner player in the history of League of Legends. Like, someone who maybe isn't like Jackie Love in terms of the best plays you've ever seen looking like unrecognizable, right? Like, it's not even League of Legends at that point. It's not quite that, in my opinion, but it's pretty darn close. What Viper does is just not make mistakes and make these, like, be in the perfect spot at every perfect time. He plays AD carry at a perfect level. There just aren't any criticisms. There's not any notes to give someone like Viper because he executes perfectly. Like, it's just ridiculous to watch him. His positioning, his blinks, the use of his safety and the use of being aggressive, like understanding when he can step up and when he doesn't need to step up and when he can't step up and who he needs to be around in order to be peeled and where exactly he needs to stand in order to make sure that he's hitting priority targets. It's just a fundamental mastery of the role, and it's really, really fun to watch. Zeka and Viper have been the stars for HLE in this series, and I'm glad that that continued here. Peanut had his best game of the series here on the Maokai. Really excited to see Maokai actually have a good game for the first time in quite a while. He was very active on the map in this one. Doran actually going for the Jax blind in this game. All of a sudden, that works out a lot better for him. What a big surprise. Camille is just not the champion I would be going towards right now. And then, of course, Delight on the Blitzcrank. Not quite the Lehens, like, I'm just going to completely break and take over the game and every play will be made around my hooks kind of game, but still a really good one. We saw this last year. I talked about how Gen.G is really good at enabling Blitzcrank players. Delight was kind of the recipient of that in 2023, so nice to see him be able to turn that into an advantage for HLE in 2024. But congratulations again to this team. They're not done, but going to a Game 5 against Gen.G, like, having that opportunity, pretty massive, and it's definitely a confidence booster. But for Gen.G, honestly, this was the first game where I'm like, you just got outplayed. You just weren't as good as HLE on the other side of that, and that is not exactly what you want to be saying going into a Silver Scrapes game number 5. I think you could point to quite a few members of this team just not really having an impact, but when you're saving R5 for something like Udyr, of course, I'm going to be critical of that. Udyr has been entirely inconsequential in basically every single game that he has been played in across every single playoffs. He's another champ that I don't get the priority at all. Like, Camille I get, because if you do get her going, if you can snowball her, like, she can obliterate games. She can do the most damage in the game by far. She can split push. She can team fight. Like, there's a lot of things that Camille can do at a really high level, so I get the priority into her if things were to go right. What is the upside of Udyr? What is the R5 upside of Udyr into Jax? Like, I don't get it, and maybe I'm not a top lane player, so I just don't understand, but Keen is gonna get dud of the game. Like, the champion just does nothing. I can't fathom picking him in such a crucial, like, series and year-defining situation like this. I don't understand. Like, the Udyr was not good. It was an entirely useless pick. The Jax, while not dominating on the other side of the matchup, was 800 times more useful than the Udyr, and this just continues to be a trend with this champion. I can't remember the last time he was actually useful in a lot of these fights and a lot of these late-game situations. But, it's not like the rest of the team was perfect. Canyon had some slip-ups here on the Zyra. Peanut was definitely better in Game 4 at generating pressure, and when you can do that on Maokai, when you are able to get into the mid-game and your team's in a good spot and you have a gold advantage, that's when Maokai becomes the hardest champion to beat in the entire game, and so Canyon just not really doing a great job of making that work out. Pays and Lehens, they're probably having their worst series all year long right now. Not that they are playing horrible. Pays was fine in Games 2 and 3, but he's not been this game breaker. He has been a game breaker for this team throughout the playoffs. He's gotten player of the series in both of their wins for me so far. Their win over DK and their win over HLE. Pays was player of the series, and he's kind of just been along for the ride here. Lehen's also just not really doing anything on the Alistair. That is reflected very well by his scoreline. Sometimes scorelines lie, it did not here. Chovy was the only one who had any sort of gold and could actually do anything in this game. People are going to criticize that he wasn't active enough on the map. I'm not really sure what you want Corki to do in this instance, but even Zeka was a lot more active, and Viper and Peanut Peanut were doing a great job at making sure that a lot of the plays that Tristana was going for aggressively were paid off. And so generally this just was HLE being better in game 4, and that is a very intriguing transition into game number 5, because if HLE can just do it one more time, they can pull off what I would consider to be one of the biggest upsets of the year up until this point. Gen.G obviously don't want that to happen. They want to keep the Golden Road alive. This has been something that's been a narrative over the last couple of years with multiple different teams, and Gen.G feels like the strongest of all of them. If they drop it here, that would certainly be a pretty big upset in my eyes. And so a very big game number 5. Can Gen.G keep their Golden Road hopes alive? Can they dominate the LCK like they were foretold to, or is HLE going to be able to knock the Kings off of their throne and take it for themselves? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and somehow, someway, against all odds, against all expectations, your 2024 Summer Split LCK champions are Hanwha Life Esports. I am stunned by this outcome. I'm going to be entirely honest with you. Gen.G were huge favorites for me coming into this series, not only because of how good Gen.G are, because they are. They really are that good going into this series. We all expected them to keep the Golden Road alive. They were the clear #1 team in the world in terms of their production over the course of this year up until this point, and so the expectation was that they were going to cement that with another trophy here in Summer Split, but it's not even just that, it's Hanwha Life, and this is not the kind of team that you would expect to pull off a gigantic upset in the finals. We've been talking about HLE as being this high floor, low ceiling type of team for a majority of this year, and I was clearly just very wrong about that. I clearly underestimated what their high end could look like. We talked about them being a clear top 3 to 5 team in the world, but did they have the ability to kind of flip into that next gear, if you will, to get to that next level and unlock a part of their game that could compete against the best team in the world and really be able to go toe-to-toe with them? In this series, for the first time, we really saw that activate. We saw a couple of these players really step up. For Gen.G, obviously, this has to feel a bit heartbreaking. You got so close to the finish line. This would have been a ridiculous run in the Summer Split just across the entire domestic LCK season, but you couldn't quite get it at the finish line, and now you're going into Worlds as the #2 seed, kind of feeling beatable for the first time for a majority of this year. There's a lot going on right now with Gen.G, and we'll talk about it when we get to their side, but starting with HLE, player of the game and player of the series, my finals MVP pick is very clearly going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. What a performance. I mean, you know, the stats page was always really funny. People brought it up in a lot of funny comparisons between him and Chovy, because Chovy's got all these titles and all of these accomplishments, and Zeka's like 2022 World's Champion, and that's it. Like, that's the only thing that he's ever, you know, gotten in terms of an achievement. He's never even made finals here in the LCK before, but in his first ever LCK finals, he ends up outplaying Chovy on the other side of this matchup and bringing his team to a victory. You know, clutch is something I don't like to bring up a lot on the channel. In fact, clutch is something that I often try to dismiss a lot on the channel in terms of my public opinion. First of all, because the sample size for clutch is just so ridiculously small. You can't really determine whether someone is or isn't good in high-pressure situations just from 1 or 2 series. It's really hard because anything can happen on any given day. But Zeka is one of those players that is going to be defined by how clutch he is. When these moments get more important, when these lights get brighter, he ends up performing so much better than so many other, you know, players that are his contemporaries. It makes him such a threat in a lot of these situations. He plays Yone here in game number 5. This is a very risky pick to play into Chovy in a deciding game number 5, and yet he comes out and dominates on the champion. It's just ridiculously impressive, and Zeka is going to deserve and earn all of the praise and all of the congratulations that he's going to get for a series like this. But I don't want to say this was a one-man show. This was not a one-man show. HLE across the board were an incredibly good team in this series. Viper is, of course, the other player that deserves a gigantic shout out. He was just straight up better than Paze, who has been like a superstar over the course of this split. I know people aren't quite caught up to where I am on Paze all of the time, but I've been talking about him as maybe the best AD carry in the world in terms of performance over the course of this year, regardless of whether or not you think that his job is a lot easier than other AD carries across the world. But Viper just outplayed him in this series. I would argue that Game 5 was one of his least impactful games of the entire series, and all 3 of their wins, he was very important. The Ziggs, the only one that's a little bit more like, Zeka was very strong. Peanut had a great game here in game number 5, and that really separated, I think, HLE from Gen.G in this one. But Viper was so important towards their earlier successes in this series. You have to shout him out. His positioning and his mechanics in this series were about as perfect as you could possibly get. This was an elite, like, number 180 carry in the world level performance, and it could not have come at a better time for HLE. I already talked about Peanut, but congratulations to him, man. This is his 7th LCK title. I've been beating the drum for Peanut for years, over and over and over again. Every single offseason, it feels like we go through the exact same story, where in the year, nobody's really talking about Peanut because everybody, wants the narrative to be that they don't like him, and he's always playing well. So he kind of goes under the radar. Nobody really brings his name up. And then he eventually loses at Worlds in the semifinals or whatever, and people talk about, oh, see, this is the Peanut. He always runs it down. He never makes it work, and yada, yada, yada. You go into the offseason, it's the same story every single year. I think at some point we have to realize that with this guy's accomplishments, with the consistency that he has shown, the fact that he has elevated every single team that he has ever played for, he's got a strong argument to be the greatest jungler in League of Legends history. Like, at this point, there really is absolutely a conversation to be started around that. A lot of people, me included, think that Canyon's peak is just the best that League has ever seen out of a player, let alone a jungler. But, Peanut's longevity, like the accolades over the course of his entire career, like, they match up very well against anybody that you could put into that conversation. Doubly so if he does go on to do really well at Worlds this year, maybe even win it. Like, if he wins Worlds, there's no more argument. He's the best jungler of all time. At that point, like, you really have to throw his name into the mix. But even now, already, with 7 LCK titles, yeah, he's gonna be on the, on the alert list. It seems like every single team that this guy touches turns into a contender, and it's ridiculous that he doesn't get the credit for that. I get that he has a lot of good teammates around him, but at some point we have to start giving Peanut his flowers. And I want to reiterate, a lot of, facilitative junglers, I say this all the time, just will never get their flowers. Players like Peanut, Tarzan, Karsa, a lot of these players that were super elite at making their teammates look like $1 million, they're never going to get the same kind of flowers that the teammates who did look like $1 million are going to get. But Peanut deserves every single bit of praise that he will get over the course of his career. Delight had a great game 5 here on the Rel. Doran was good enough on the Jax. He looked much better on the Jax than something like the Camille as that blind pick. Overall, just love HLE's game here in Game 5. Everything that you could have hoped and prayed for if you were a Hanwha Life Esports fan came into fruition here. Just the miracle ending. Truly a miracle ending for a miracle team. And then for Gen.G, we already talked about it a bit, but this is a really big disappointing performance, I would say. I think you went into this series with basically the expectation of either you won it or it was a massive disappointment with how things have gone this year. And unfortunately, losing it does mean that it stings a lot more because you were such heavy favorites. Dead of the game in Game 5 is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane. I think this is one of the weaker games that he has played. Now, as I said with the Zeka thing, clutch is just one of those things that I don't really believe in. If you want to, sit here and say choky or whatever, then do, it's a free country, do what you want in the comments. I don't agree. I've never agreed. I've pushed back on that narrative heavily. I think he's proven that every single time he's actually been given an opportunity. I don't think Game 5 completely undoes every single good game that he has had over the course of this year and over the course of this playoff run even in particular, but it is worth noting that he wasn't very good. He got outplayed by Zeka here in game number 5, and this is just not the time for that to happen. Like, especially if you want to get rid of that narrative, this was not the result that I think Chovy really needed to have. I think Pays and Lehens also probably had their worst series of the entire year. We were already talking about that leading into this. Maybe not the year, because there were some in spring that were very up and down, but certainly of the summer split, we were already talking going into game 5 that there were some inconsistencies from Pays and Lehens, who had been dominating the 2v2 in the late game in a lot of these situations. They just were never as relevant. Viper was by far the best player in the bot lane in this series, and that's just not a great sign for Gen.G. Canyon, I think, had a couple of up and down games. The Skarner ended up being less useful as the series went along. Keen was, I guess, generally fine here, but the Cassante just didn't really matter in game number 5. Like, there are definitely some things to take away from this series, but if you're a Gen.G fan, you just have to hope that, okay, we lost one series on one day. Like, we've been able to beat HLE a bunch leading into this. We've been able to beat everybody else a bunch leading into this. So what? We lost one series. And honestly, I think that that's a pretty valid way of thinking. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm just, overly confident in the tape that I've seen over the course of this year, and I'm not taking enough into the LCK finals, but losing one series doesn't completely get rid of all of the faith and thought that I had into this team. I said the same thing about Team Liquid yesterday when I covered the LCS finals. Like, if you've shown that you are the best team in the league all split up until the finals and then you lose the finals, like, okay, you lost one day. Hopefully you get them next time. Like, I feel good about Gen.G going into Worlds. I just hope that this isn't sign of things to come. And then for HLE, what a win. Like, truly, what a ridiculous win for this team. Everything that they could have asked for is here. Like, these players have all earned it. You know, bringing in core members of the Gen.G roster only to beat them in the summer finals and get that #1 seed. It's just a ridiculous story. It's a ridiculous narrative, and it really is kind of a fairy tale ending for this org and these players. Hopefully they can carry this momentum into the World Championships, but regardless, I'm going to look back on this year and them being able to win the LCK as one of the biggest accomplishments this org has ever had. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Finals overview and analysis video in the Summer Split Playoffs. Up on the screen, history has indeed been rewritten. Hanwha Life Esports taking home the 2024 LCK Championship. I'm just so proud and so excited for this org and for these players. They obviously have deserved it. They have earned it. Watching players like Dandy and Mowgli, you know, who are obviously coaches for this team, stand on stage alongside them and celebrate in this achievement as well. It's just a ridiculous feeling. I can't imagine how great this is for the org, how great it is for the players, but their job is not done. They are now going as the #1 seed to Worlds. #2 will, of course, be Gen.G. They're losers in the finals, so they're not going to be resting on their laurels. I imagine they're back in the practice facility tomorrow, figuring out what they want to do and how they want to prep for the biggest tournament of the year. But I do want to point something out. Maybe this is a little bit Gen.G favored in terms of a narrative, but honestly, historically, LCK #1 seeds, a little bit questionable at Worlds, and it's definitely something that's I'm going to continue to monitor. I think HLE is good enough to be able to break that trend, but it's usually the LCK 2 or 3 seed that actually does really well at the tournament. We'll see if that ends up lasting into 2024. Just something that I thought was curious. I would have pointed this out whether or not Gen.G won or not. You know, this isn't like trying to justify things for Gen.G, but just certainly a little bit of a narrative that I think is kind of intriguing to talk about. But we're talking about the 1 and 2 seeds. We don't even know who the 3 and the 4 seeds are. And up on the screen now, we're going to see the bracket that's going to determine who those are going to be. The 3 through 6 seeds in terms of championship points are slotted in here to the regional finals. They obviously go through the same tournament that the LPL went through like a couple of weeks ago. The 3 and the 4 seed, T1 and D plus Kia, in this case, will face off against each other. The winner of that goes to Worlds as the #3 seed representing the LCK. The loser moves on to one more game to take on the winner of KT Rolster and Fear X. I think if I had to make a prediction on how this would end up, I think T1 will beat D plus Kia. I think they will be going to Worlds as the #3 seed representing the LCK, and then I think KT is better than Fear X. We're getting a D plus Kia versus KT Rolster matchup for that #4 seed, and that's really the one that could go either way. If you think KT has that miracle run in them, that, you know, crazy fire, like, you know, KTRX blood in them, then I think it's totally valid to predict them to win a series like this. They can beat anyone on any given day, and they've had a lot more time to prep and get ready. DK is, again, one of those higher floor, lower ceiling types of teams. They are a team that you can expect to beat up on any team that makes mistakes, but they don't necessarily have the upside, in my opinion, to really make a gigantic difference. I think DK is definitely the safer guess, if only because they've done better in recent weeks, but man, KT Rolster, I'm honestly going to predict them. Like, they would be my prediction to go to Worlds as the #4 seed. I just don't really believe in DK at the current moment. I don't believe in, like, the foundation of this team. I think especially if bot lane isn't nearly as good as they performed in the regular season, which I think is very realistic, then KT actually should just be the better of these two teams. But let me know if you agree or disagree with T1 and KT being my 2 picks coming out of the regional finals, whether or not you agree that the LCK 1 seed curse is actually a bit concerning, or whether or not you think I'm just making a mountain out of a molehill. Let me know. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, Worlds is right around the corner, but we're not even done with the LCK. We talked about the regional finals. We will, of course, be covering all of those series on the channel in the upcoming days. We're covering the NACL finals tomorrow on this channel, Tier 2 over in North America. We covered the LCS finals yesterday on this channel, so if you're interested in any of that stuff, please check it out. But of course, with Worlds coverage right around the corner, you don't want to miss anything coming up. Hit the subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all